Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. I'm your host, Trisha, and today we are discussing a topic of immense importance and complexity: the future of Syria's oil and gas industry after the fall of Bashar al Assad's regime. More than a decade of civil war, external interference, and crippling sanctions have left Syria's energy sector in tatters. Today, we'll explore how Syria's oil industry has been affected by this turmoil and what the future might hold. Joining me to help break down these intricacies is Sandesh, who has extensive experience in regions affected by conflict. Sandesh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Trisha. It's pleasure to be here. This is a critical issue and I am excited to dive into it with you. The future of Syria's oil sector is deeply intertwined with the country's broader political and economic recovery. So there is a lot to discuss.
Absolutely, Sandesh. So let's start with some background. Before the war, Syria's oil industry was a key pillar of its economy, although not on a scale of some of its neighbors. So, can you give us a rundown of Syria's oil industry prior to 2011?
Absolutely, Trisha. The Syria's oil sector, while relatively small compared to some of the regional giants like Saudi Arabia or Iraq, or we know there are other OPEC countries, and it was still a critical component of the country's economy. It played an outsized role in the supporting government's revenue, foreign exchange earnings, and then domestic energy needs. The oil industry was one of the few resources that Syria had an abundance, and along with its agriculture, and it helped to stabilize the country's economic structure to some extent. So, before the civil war erupted into 2011, Syria's oil sector accounted for approximately 25% of the government's total revenue. And oil was Syria's most significant natural resource. And it played a key role in the state's financial health, particularly given that Syria has a limited other mineral resources. And at the time, Syria had proven oil reserves of around 2.5 billion barrels, which, while not enormous by global standards if we compared with the other such nations like Saudi Arabia or US, but they were still substantial for a country of Syria's size and population. And this allowed Syria to maintain a production level around 0.38 million barrels per day, up to they have reached once 0.4 million barrels per day. And it was between 2008 and 2010, and that level of production was enough to meet the country's domestic demand for energy while also providing an export surplus. The important point I have to mention here, the bulk of Syria's oil reserves were located in the eastern part of the country, and they were primarily in the governorates of the Deir ez-Zor and Hazaga. These regions were home to Syria's largest and most productive fields, and it includes Al Omar and Swidiya field. The Al Omar field, for example, if I have to give, it was Syria's largest oil field, and at its peak, it produced roughly around 80,000 barrels per day. It is a significant contributor to national output. The country's refineries were also concentrated in these particular areas that created a central hub for refining and distributing oil. And additionally, the oil sector was managed by the state-owned Syrian Petroleum Company, or in short form we call it as SPC. And it oversaw both production and distribution, and it provided oversight to foreign oil companies operating in the company. So this company was working well and was profitable for some part of the year, specifically between 2008 to 2010. However, there were challenges even before the war began. For one, Syria's oil infrastructure was aging. Most of the production and refinery facility were built in the way back. That is, around, if we consider today's time, it was around 50 years back. It was in the 1970s and 1980s. And over time, they become increasingly inefficient and costly to maintain. So there was a noticeable lack of investment in modernization, or we can say that technological improvements. And this stagnation meant that Syria's oil output had been slowly declining even before the war. While production had been steady in the early 2000s, Syria was already experiencing difficulties in keeping up with the growing demand and had become a net importer of oil products. Specifically, those are the refined oil products, and it was to meet domestic needs. So there was a shortfall of oil products, and those were deficited and offsetted with the respect to the imports. While there was a deficit of refined oil product, the another issue was with respect to Syria's energy industries, that foreign investment was very limited. While there were foreign companies, specifically from Russia and other countries, that were involved in exploration and production in the country, the overall level of foreign capital flowing into the sector was not as high as it could have been. So the reasons for this were multi-faced. The country's political and economic climate was seen as unstable, and there were concerns about potential regional instability that could affect investment. These were some of the reasons, and nonetheless, despite these limitations, the oil sector was still a key revenue generator for Syria. So the income generated from oil exports, primarily to the neighboring countries, it provided a substantial amount of foreign currency to the government. And this was a crucial for a country like Syria, which faced ongoing economic challenges, including high inflation and external debt. So as a result, the oil industry was not just an economic driver, but also a strategic asset for the Syrian government. It was used to finance state functions, military expenditures, and government subsidies for key sectors such as food and fuel, which helped maintain domestic stability. So, if you consider its neighbor, the Iraq, during Saddam Hussein era, there was a program called Food for Energy, and this is how Saddam Hussein and the regional Iraqi government used to get foreign money into the country, and they can subsidize the food accordingly. Having said that, Syria's oil sector was an important part of the broader regional energy landscape. And while it wasn't a major player on the global oil market, but it played a more significant role in the local and regional context, specifically if we think about country as a Syria. And Syria's oil export, though not massive, they were an important trade good for neighboring countries, particularly in the context of energy independence in the region. It also played a role in the broader geopolitics of the Middle East, and especially with the regard to Syria's relationship with the countries like Iraq, Turkey, and its regional ally Iran. And despite these challenges, the oil industry was still a lifeline for Syria's economy and helped the country maintain a certain level of functionality in the terms of energy production, government revenues, and even the foreign exchange earnings. The decline of oil production after the war broke out in 2011 has been one of the major contributing factors to the economic collapse and the ongoing humanitarian crisis. And having said that, what was once a key pillar of Syria's economy, it became a heavily contested and ultimately diminished resource, and it caught up in the wider geopolitical and military struggles that defined the conflict. So, if I have to summarize, while Syria was never a top tier oil producer in the region, the oil sector was undoubtedly vital for its economy, and both in terms of providing energy for domestic use and generating revenue for the government. And the deterioration of this sector as a result of the war has had far-reaching consequences. And it's something that country will need to address if there is any hope for long-term recovery.
So, Sandesh, even before the conflict began, we know that Syria was facing challenges in maintaining its oil production. So, with that in mind, when the war erupted in 2011, how did it affect the oil sector? Could you explain us the key events that led to the collapse of the production?
Well, to explain this, we have to go back in a history. And absolutely, the civil war had a catastrophic impact on Syria's oil sector. And there were several key events that led to dramatic collapse of production. But initially, when the conflict erupted in 2011, Assad regime began losing control over the large areas of country. And that includes some of Syria's most crucial oil producing regions in the east. And namely, if I have to say, those are the Deir, Zor, Hasaka, and Raqqa. So these areas were home to some of the Syria's largest and most productive oil fields, and the loss of control over them was the first major blow to the industry. So I have to be apolitical here. By 2013, an extremist group operating in the region, they had seized the control of many of these vital oil fields, and one of the most significant was the Al Omar field in the Deir Zor, and it has been Syria's largest oil field. It producing around 80,000 barrels per day before the war, like I have mentioned earlier. And with the control to this extremist group, production in these fields plummeted. And these extremist group, they didn't just seize the control; they also exploited the oil resources for their own funding, and they were selling crude on the black market, and they were funding their insurgency, and it further destabilized the region. And at the same time, the regime struggles to maintain access to the oil producing areas they still control. The war led to frequent airstrikes and military confrontations, and even they sabotage the targeting oil infrastructure. And both the militants groups or the extremist groups in particular and the coalition forces conducting the airstrike that destroyed much of the oil infrastructure. Those includes pipelines, then refineries, storage facilities, tanks, and this widespread destruction drastically reduced the country's ability to produce and refine oil. So that was the background, and it was until the war. But as the war progressed, there were a different kind of elements involved in the picture. So we have one Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces with the backing of the US. They began taking control of some of the oil fields in the northeastern Syria, and those including in the Deir ez-Zor basin. But by that point, much of the infrastructure was already destroyed, and that damage was extensive. So, you have to imagine the era where almost it was a geopolitically unstable region. Every different entity was involved. There was US involved, there was Iran involved, there was Russia involved, and other different geopolitically kind of countries who have global power or who supposed to or who want to be a global power. These were starting getting hands on this Syrian war. By 2015, the Syrian oil production had collapsed over 400,000 barrels per day to just under 25,000 barrels per day. And this was a devastating decline for the country. As oil had previously been a major source of revenue, contributing about quarter of the government's income before the war, within the oil fields in the rebel and these extremist groups, the Assad regime was unable to access most of the country's oil resources. And at the same time, they were having international sanctions, which further has a significant impact on the Syrian government's earnings, and it was a brutal tactics in the war, and it made it nearly impossible for Syria to maintain any substantial oil trade. The sanctions, those are there in place. They restricted the flow of resources, and at the same time technical expertise needed to maintain in the oil country also get declined. So the situation was further compounded by the Syria's increasing reliance on oil imports, specifically from Iran. So, till today or till the day of Assad regime was overthrown, Iran was a key ally to the Syria, and almost all of oil imports, those were going into Syria, were going from Iran. And we have seen on the same day where when the Assad regime was overthrown, one of the Suezmax containing gasoline, it started moving back because there was no surety of payments getting released for that particular material. So the flows, those were going into Syria, were mostly by Iran. The transportational and logistical challenges due to the destroyed infrastructure and ongoing fighting at that time, it was meant that if oil was produced in certain areas, it was difficult to transport it across the country. So oil was either trapped in the areas of conflict or they held by fractions that weren't able to effectively move it to the refinery. So you have to see the scenario from the point of country-wise effectiveness, because on one side you have a production decline, on the other side you have your infrastructure substantially damaged, and another side you are importing massively from the countries like Iran, and overall it will impact the earnings. The countries were going into massive debt that I mentioned earlier. Having said that, the widespread destruction of critical infrastructure such as pipeline, refineries, and transport network left Syria in a position where rebuilding its oil sector was no longer just about restoring the production. So, this pipeline, refineries, and the transport networks, if they are damaged, then there is no replacement, at least on an immediate purpose. So you need to build new pipelines or you need to build new refineries, and those are the costly process. At the same time, those maintaining the existing which are in the damaged condition or the repairing of them is again costly process, and it's a time consuming process. So there were a significant impact on the oil sector of Syria, and with the ongoing conflict and political fragmentation, it was a task that seems almost insurmountable. So the fall of oil production was thus combination of direct control by this militant group and the destruction of infrastructure by various fighting factions and the worsening international sanctions that crippled Syria's ability to engage in oil trade. So all these factors combined to reduce Syria's oil output to a fraction of what it had been before the war. And it is something the country will have to address if it ever hopes to revive its oil industry in the future.
That's definitely a staggering decline in production. So, with the loss of control over oil fields and infrastructure, Sandesh, would you tell us how did the Assad regime cope with Syria's energy needs?
Well, the Assad regime response was multifaceted. It deeply challenged by shifting dynamics in the region. First and foremost, the regime became heavily reliant on imports of oil and refined products, particularly from Iran. And throughout the war, Iran was a crucial ally, providing both military support and financial assistance that includes consistent oil shipments. And at one point, these imports were pivotal in offsetting Syria's drastically reduced domestic oil production capacity. However, this dependency introduces vulnerabilities. So you have to focus on this particular point because the vulnerabilities which led in the future to overthrow the Assad regime. So the international sanctions on Iran, it complicated logistic and disrupted supply chains and it exacerbated the energy crisis within Syria. The situation worsened again when Iraq, it was another key source of crude oil imports. So reports indicate that Syria had been importing approximately 122,000 barrels per day from Iraq, and the cessation of this supply dealt a heavy blow to Syria's ability to meet domestic energy needs. Now, compounding the issue, internal crude shipments from eastern Syria, it was under the control of Kurdish affiliated SDF. They were also halted. So it was a kind of a backlash for entire Syrian oil industry when you are having disruptions from Iraq, you are having disruptions from domestic oil production. And this further tightened the regime's access to oil and it forcing to ration available resources within the territories under its control. And when this was going, Iran's position as a lifeline for Syria was also undermined. Following the collapse of the Assad government earlier this month, Iran's oil shipments ceased entirely, and one tanker reportedly turned back mid-voyage, symbolizing the abrupt end of critical supply chains, which I also mentioned earlier. Previously, Iran had been exporting approximately 60,000 barrels per day to Syria, and this cessation, combined with country's own diminished production, estimated at just 80,000 barrels per day, further deepened the energy crisis. Additionally, the collapse of central governments and the advance of opposition forces such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or we call it as STS, it created new obstacles for the energy distribution. So STS occupation of strategic areas including Damascus and major highways like the M4, it disrupted the transportation routes, particularly those crude oil tankers, those were traveling on roads, and it further complicating the movement of fuel from Syria's refineries to areas under regime control. The military losses and the subsequent geopolitical shifts have effectively fragmented Syria's energy landscape and making coordination nearly impossible. And the regime's economic hardship even intensified because the fuel prices has skyrocketed, particularly because of three reasons. First one is supply disruptions, second reason is black marketing, and third reason is the roads, those were in block. So the civilians, they were already burdened by years of war. They were tired of years of war and then the sanctions, and they were facing unprecedented cost for basic necessity. So what option they will have? They will always go and oppose the current regime, that is Assad regime. So what they were facing were massive at that time. The fuel station stocks were dwindled and the transportation of gasoline and diesel became increasingly challenging. There were kilometers of queues behind this fuel station, and it was a scarcity, but this scarcity not only hindered daily life, but it also severely impacted even the industries. Those are the small scale industries and large scale industry. And at the same time, the agriculture production, and it was pushing the country deeper into the economic despair. So, in a hindsight, the Assad regime's inability to reform its military and governance structures, they played a significant role in the collapse. And when the military disintegrated, so did the regime's control over the critical resources. And that includes energy too. So the power vacuum left in Assad's wake has upended the strategic balance of power in the region. So with the neighboring countries and actors like Turkey, Russia, and Iran scrambling to adapt to the new reality. Today, Syria's energy crisis stands as a stark reminder of how deeply intertwined geopolitics and resource management are. The collapse of traditional supply chains, the proliferating of competing factions, and the fragmentation of control have rendered the country's energy landscape one of the most complex and dire in the modern history.
That was very well explained, Sandesh. It's clear that the war's impact on Syria's oil industry has been profound. Now, as we look ahead to the possibility of a post Assad Syria, assuming that the Assad's regime fall is permanent, what do you think the future holds for Syria's oil and gas industry? And what will it take for Syria to revive its energy sector?
So that's a good question, Trisha. The road to revival will be extremely challenging, but I will say it's not impossible. The reason because Syria's oil reserves, primarily located in this Deir ez-Zor, Hasaka, and Raqqa, they remain a key asset, and they will remain a key asset forever. But however, I will say the country will face numerous hurdles in reviving its oil sector. The important factor that can impact the road to revival is the issue of security. The country remains deeply fragmented, and with the different fractions controlling various parts of oil infrastructure, we may not see a significant development in the future. So now we have a SDF, that is Syrian Democratic Forces. They were backed by US and they control much of the oil sector, and it was in the east of Syria. At the same time, we have another faction, those are Turkish backed rebels. They hold other territories. So the future of the entire region, it will play a crucial role in the recovery of the oil industry. So the competing interest of these factions and their international backers will need to be resolved to create a unified strategy for managing countries' resources. And without a favorable resolution, the conflict over these oil-rich areas could persist, further delaying any meaningful progress. So we know we have seen a similar situation in Libya, where two of the different factions hold different oil assets, and they were facing conflict in the time to play a significant role in the Libya's oil production. So, having said that, the second major challenge in the state of Syria's oil infrastructure is the entire assets. Those include pipelines and refineries. Those are very heavily damaged during the war. Some of the facilities even been bombed and they were neglected, and some of them even looted, and it leaves the country's energy sector in shambles. So rebuilding this entire infrastructure will require massive investment, and it is something Syria cannot afford alone, given its devastated economy and lack of access to foreign capital. So you have to imagine from the perspective of this. So entire country has been, the infrastructure is a kind of a heavily damaged. So people, they first need homes. So the local level infrastructure need to be implemented first, and then we can see that energy or oil related infrastructure will getting established. So it's a time consuming process, and we hope that they will keep capture the progress it's supposed to be there in the moment. So what else they need? They need international companies and those large scale companies that could play a pivotal role in the rebuilding process. But having said that, their involvement will depend on the range of factors. It includes the security guarantees, the legal protection, and the potential of profit, because no one will be coming for charity. So the profit factor should be there, whether it will be negligible, but still they will seek some profit from that. And having said that, unfortunately, with the sanctions still in place, attracting such high investment will be extremely difficult. At this point of time, we don't know whether these sanctions will be getting lifted anytime in soon. And the sanctions represent a third critical hurdle itself, because the international community, particularly The US and EU specifically, those are the Western dominance countries. They have imposed several economic sanctions on Syria, and one of the sanctions it targets the key sectors such as energy. So these sanctions were initially aimed to weaken Assad regime, but their impact has extended to the broader economy. And now we are seeing the crippling any efforts to rebuild the economy. So for Syria to survive its oil and gas industry, sanctions would need to be lifted or at least eased for some amount of time, which we have seen last time in Venezuela. So, however, this is unlikely to happen without any significant political and economic reforms. The formation of new internationally recognized government would be a kind of a crucial step towards achieving this. Having said that, this government is an interim government, so there will be an election in the future. And this interim government, such a government would need to demonstrate its commitment to the peace, currency, and inclusive governance to gain the trust of the global community. So, Trisha, another major factor I like to mention here is the resolution of territorial disputes. So much of the Syria's oil is located in the regions that are currently outside the control of any centralized authority. For instance, the SDF, they control much of eastern Syria and has its own governance structures and is unlikely to cede control without assurances about its political future. Similarly, we have Turkish-backed rebels. They were also having their own interest and they were kind of often aligning with the Turkish regional ambitions. Syria, Turkey, Iran, and I will say others. At the same time, we have Kurdish forces or the Kurdish regions. So all of them have presence in Syria, and right now it's a difficult situation because the region has been divided amongst these particular entities, and all of them have their own ambitions and own interests. And if that is there, then it will be kind of a subject to impact the energy sector. So, negotiating a settlement that addresses these competing claims amongst them, it will be essential for stabilizing the country and reviving the energy sector. So, this process will likely require the involvement of major international powers, specifically from the US, Russia, and Turkey, as well as regional actors like Iran and the Gulf states. And to sum up, finally, there is a challenge of fostering a stable and skilled workforce. Years of conflict have driven many Syrians, including engineers, technicians, and other skilled professionals, and they already left the country. So there is a kind of a challenge with respect to skilled workforce, with respect to economy, with respect to the importation of the products that are needed for the local or domestic use. At the same time, what Syria needs to do, it should attract individuals back to Syria and they should start training a new generation of workers because, ultimately it should be a crucial for rebuilding the energy sector. So the country has to be built by Syrians first, and to build the country, they should need a skilled Syrians. So overall, this will require not only investment in education, but also training programs, but also the creation of environment where people feel safe and optimistic about the future. It may be a key reason for Syria's economy to bounce back again.
Now, speaking of sanctions, because you mentioned them earlier, there is growing debate about whether they should be lifted to aid Syria's recovery or not. So, how do you see this unfolding, and what would be the implications be?
The lifting of sanction is double-edged sword. On one hand, it could provide the necessary breathing room for Syria to rebuild its oil and gas industry and infrastructure. Before the war, Syria's oil sector was a cornerstone of its economy, contributing significantly, generating critical funds, creating jobs, lay a groundwork for broader economic recovery. However, the question of when and how to lift sanctions is fraught with the complexities. Lifting sanctions on an immediate basis, it may create any kind of a economic windfall and it could exacerbate existing divisions for fuel further conflict. But for sanction relief to have a positive impact, there should be a clear framework and it should ensure revenue from oil production because it is used for national rebuilding rather than perpetuating a factional dispute. And this will require a functioning, inclusive government capable of managing this resource transparently and equitably. So the broader geopolitical dynamics also complicate matters because Syria's oil resources are not only an internal issue but also a focal point for international power struggles. So I have also mentioned how different entities got involved into the Russia in Syria. So if I have to give us example of Russia, for instance, they have already established significant influence in Syria's energy structure because their national companies who are in the scope of exploration and production, they were having agreements with the Assad regime, and on the international level, they were still exist and they will be concluded significantly if sanctions will be eased. At the same time, we have a Turkey. It seeks control and influence northern regions that are strategically vital for potential energy corridors. And apart from its neighbors, the United States, through its support of the SDF, it maintains leverage over much of Syria's eastern oil fields. And any decision to lift sanctions will need to consider these competing interests as well as the risk of alienating key allies or emboldening adversaries. So another critical factor is international community's approach to reconstruction aid, because sanction relief should ideally be tied to measurable progress in the political reform, such as human rights and stabilization efforts. This conditionally could help ensure that the benefits of oil revenue are directed towards rebuilding infrastructure. Then it can provide some of the services, those are essential services, and it can foster national reconciliation. However, enforcing such condition will be a significant challenge, and particularly in a fragmented and war-torn nations like Syria. So I want to mention one of the important point here, Disha. This overthrow of Assad regimes, it generates a nationalism amongst the country's people, and when you have a kind of evolving nationalism amongst the people, amongst the residents or citizens, it will help the economy in a faster way because it boosts the work culture, or it boosts the people's momentum to support the government to rebuild its nation. So from a practical standpoint, sanctions relief alone will not be enough to revive Syria's energy sector, and the country will still need a significant foreign investment, and attracting this investment will depend not only on the lifting sanction but also on the establishment of legal and regulatory frameworks. So, first thing they need to establish is the constitution. Then, from the constitution, the legal amendments will get established, and then they will seek a legal and regulatory framework to this sanction relief. So, in conclusion, I have to say the lifting of sanction has a potential to act as a catalyst for Syria's recovery, but only if it is a part of a broader, well coordinated strategy that addresses the underlying political, economic, and security challenges. Premature or unconditional sanctions relief could risk entrenching existing divisions and perpetuating instability. So, for Syria to truly benefit, the international community must strike a dedicated balance, and it has to ensure any economic opening is accompanied by robust measures, and it should promote peace, governance, and sustainable development. And if that happens, only then can Syria's oil will serve as a tool for national healing rather than a source of further discord.
It definitely sounds like Syria's oil future will depend not only on geopolitical shifts but also on careful management of its energy resources so that they can avoid any further conflict. Now, given that, what role might regional powers like Turkey play in shaping Syria's post Assad energy landscape?
Well, I have already mentioned that different entities involved in the reshaping Syria's energy future, but Turkey's role in shaping Syria's energy future could be quite pivotal because as a regional hub, Turkey has a long aim to become a central player in energy transit across Middle East and Europe. Because the Turkey is geographically situated in such a geographical area where it has a easy access in the Middle East, it has a easy access to Russia, it has easy access to Europe, and at the same time it has easy access to other part of the world as a regional energy hub, because Russia wants to be an regional energy hub. So Turkey's investment in large scale projects such as Tanap pipeline, that is a kind of a trans-Anatolian natural gas pipeline, they have already demonstrated its ambition to secure its position as a critical energy sector or establishing such energy corridors. So, given this, Turkey's involvement in Syria's post-Assad energy landscape, it could be extensive, and especially as we know that Syria seeks to rebuild its war-torn infrastructure, it could be a kind of a game-changing pivot. And one of the most promising areas for Turkey's engagement could be the renewable energy sector. You know, the Syria has immense potential when it comes to solar energy, and the country's vast desert landscape make it an ideal location for large-scale solar projects. So Turkey's renewable energy sector has flourished in recent years, and especially when it's focused on solar and wind energy. You know, it could serve as a crucial partner in Syria's transition towards cleaner energy. So the given Turkey's experience in setting up infrastructure for renewable energy, it's not far-fetched to imagine that they could play a key role in pivoting the technical expertise and then in the investment and again the logistical supports it needed to help Syria. So, in addition, if I have to say, the Turkey could facilitate Syria's integration into a broader Eastern Mediterranean energy grid, because it could involve connecting Syrian energy system to existing pipelines and grids, and such as those that traverse through the Turkey, and even extending the reach of the regional energy market. So such an integration could reduce energy isolation for Syria, and it could provide a stable supply of electricity and natural hub, and it foster economic interdependence between Syria and its neighbors. So this energy cooperation can be established as a tool for, let's say, for long-term regional stability. It could promote peace, and it could bring nations together, it could bring cultures together, it could link economic interest, and if that happens, then the making a conflict over resources, it would be a less appealing for both the countries, and then it can possibly reduce the kind of a conflict in the areas where the energy resources are placed, and it could bring back the old production levels online and can reduce the import dependence from its neighbors. But however, Turkey's involvement it's not without its challenge, because Turkey has its own challenge, and one of the major complication comes from the fact that Turkey has its own strategic interests tied to the energy infrastructure, and it particularly with regards to the pipeline routes, and with its ambition to increase its role as an energy hub. Turkey's push to integrate Syria into its energy projects, it might clash with the plans of other regional powers, and we know those powers are Iran and Russia, because both of these countries have been involved in Syria for years and now supporting the Assad regime, and both have significant energy interest in the region. So, you know, at the same time, now the geopolitics have significantly change over the years. We have now BRICS expansion where Russia, China, India are kind of a dominant nations, and even now Iran is joining BRICS. So it could potentially divert some of the tensions between these countries who are seeking kind of a similar intention or having a similar ambitions in the energy landscape. Furthermore, if I have to say, Turkey's desire to extend its influence over northern Syria, and it includes areas like oil-rich regions like Deir ez-Zor, and it could create some tensions with other factions within Syria, and it includes SDF, then the Kurdish groups, and even the local tribal leaders. So this tension could spill over into the energy sector, and it makes cooperation or a kind of a more delicate balancing act. So, to sum up the future of Syria's energy landscape, it will likely depend on the ability of all regional powers, including Turkey, to find a common ground or at least coexist peacefully while advancing their own interests. So, given the volatile and competitive nature of regional politics, the Turkey's involvement in Syria's energy reconstruction, it will likely need to be negotiated carefully, and it need to balance economic interest with the broader geopolitical considerations. And ultimately, Turkey's role could either lead to greater stability or it can exacerbate any existing tensions. What will going to happen, we can't assume right now, and we can predict that the complex relationship will eventually dissolve and Syria will bounce back its production levels and kind of survive its oil and energy sector.
Thanks a lot, Sandesh. It has been an incredibly insightful conversation, and it's definitely clear that Syria's oil and gas sector, while facing immense challenges, still holds potential. And of course, much will depend on the future political landscape, regional cooperation, and international investments as well.
Thank you, Trisha. It's been pleasure to dive deep into these issues, and there is a lot of uncertainty ahead. Rebuilding of Syria's oil sector, it could play a pivotal role in its recovery, and the key will be ensuring that the process is inclusive, then it should be stable and sustainable.
Absolutely, Sandesh. And thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. We wish you all a very belated Merry Christmas and a happy and a prosperous New Year ahead. We'll be back soon with more discussions on global energy dynamics. Until next time, navigate safely and stay informed.